these issues, but I can assure the member that we are doing everything we can within our powers to try and change behaviours and make sure that we do reduce the problem of air pollution in our urban areas.
Thank you. That ends topical question time. We now move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8840 in the name of David Stewart on the report on tackling child sexual exploitation. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now, and it might be helpful to the Minister and members if I indicate at the outset that we have got some time in hand if members wish to take interventions or take a wee bit longer to develop their point, then I'm quite sure that that will find favour with the presiding officers. I call on Dave Stewart to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Public Petitions Committee. Mr Stewart, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And the Petition Committee role, in my view, is to shine a light into the dark corners of Scotland. In my view, there can be no darker corner than child sexual exploitation. The committee inquiry has concluded with 28 powerful and significant recommendations. I hope the Scottish Government, in time, will accept them all and make a contribution to better and more coordinated practice by professionals across Scotland. If we save one child from child sexual exploitation, the report was worth doing. The evidence given to us over the last 10 months was occasionally harrowing and sometimes distressing, but the committee did not flinch from its task just because it was difficult. My thanks go to Bernardos, who are in the gallery today, for putting forward their petition and for their consistently high level of cooperation and support. And I would also want to place on record my personal thanks, Presiding Officer, to all the committee members for their contributions, particularly Chick Brodie, the Deputy Convener, who chaired 2 evidence sessions for me following my Achilles injury last year. And Anne Peat and her team of clerks were first class, and many thanks go to all of them. I'd also like to put on record the committee's thanks to our adviser Sarah Nelson, who provided valuable direction and insight, a result of her many years of research in this field. The committee wishes her well with future projects. This is the first inquiry report of the committee this session, and I welcome the opportunity today to highlight our work, the evidence we heard and our findings. I'd like to explain a little about the background to this inquiry. Presiding Officer, I've heard it said that the Public Petition Committee don't do inquiries, but that is exactly what the Public Petitions Committee does do, day in and day out. We have many inquiries in the back of nearly every public petition lodged. However, the committee's investigation into tackling child sexual exploitation was a longer and more in-depth inquiry. Our work culminated in the publication of a report containing a number of recommendations for action, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's responses in our wind-up. This was a subject area that warranted a more in-depth approach. I, of course, understand that it straddled a number of subject committee areas, but given the legislative loads of these other committees, we decided to initiate the inquiry ourselves. The committee work started with the petition lodged in July 2011 by Bernardos Scotland. Bernardos was urging new research into the nature and scope of child sexual exploitation in Scotland and called for a new dedicated Scottish Government guidelines. At the time when we received the petition, Bernardos told the committee it was seriously concerned that the true nature and scale of CSE in Scotland was not known, and indeed it was on the increase. It saw a pressing need for research to be carried out in Scotland to assess prevalence along the lines of research that has already been carried out in England. And Bernardos Scotland has been in dialogue with the Scottish Government, but told us it received no commitment to take action. The feeling was that in times of economic pressures, local authorities would find it difficult to justify additional spending to prevent and provide services to support victims of child sexual exploitation without there being clear and robust evidence of the scale of the problem. Thus, the need for research to provide the clear evidence required. And the guidelines in place at the time dated back to 2003. Now, they focused mainly on young people who had run away from home or who had been exploited through becoming involved in prostitution. The guidelines do not take account of the modern reality of young people's use of technology and the risks they can face by online grooming and social networking sites. Now, we know it's not just runaways and children who have been drawn into prostitution who are at risk of sexual exploitation. Sadly, it's all our children, and the risks are not always from older people. It can just as easily be their peers who are perpetrators. So the guidance needs to be updated to recognise this, and we're pleased to note that as a result of the committee's interest in this area, the Scottish Government is now taking steps to update this material. We also welcome the announcement that the Minister has commissioned the University of Bedfordshire to do some preliminary research work in Scotland. The research assessed what information was available on prevalence in Scotland, looking at the existing statistical base, and took some soundings from professionals and their views on the extent and nature of CSE in Scotland. Once that research became available, it confirmed to the committee that tackling child sexual exploitation needs to be given a much higher priority here in Scotland. The committee decided to move this up the agenda itself by conducting its own inquiry and calling for evidence. We agreed a very specific remit for inquiry. The committee was aware, of course, of work being done elsewhere and didn't want to duplicate that. For our part, what we agreed to do was to establish the nature and extent of child sexual exploitation in Scotland. Our first call of evidence was aimed at getting the views of the service providers, often the third sector, working in the field, and of course the service users, the young people themselves. And we posed a number of specific questions. This approach worked well and received some very powerful evidence and accounts from across Scotland from young people who had found themselves victims. If I could just highlight two anonymised case studies, Presiding Officer. We heard from a 28-year-old female from Fife who told us that her exploitation began by peers when she was just 12 or 13. She was pressurised into sexual activity and given drugs and alcohol in exchange for sexual favours. She said that counselling had been helpful, but that better awareness is required. She pointed out that in her experience, exploitation among peers is common, particularly so with young girls, and that more needs to be done in schools to educate young people and enable them to be more resilient. The second case study was James, who was 15. He comes from a chaotic home and identifies himself as being gay. His mother had significant mental health difficulties and attempted suicide, on occasion in James's presence. James experienced violence at the hands of his mother's partners and witnessed domestic violence, and after a serious incident, he was taken into a local authority children's home. James is shy and began making contact with men on social networking and dating sites. He initially lied about his age, but was always honest when he met up with anyone. All of the men he met were adults, in the age range 20 to 45, and all were aware of James's real age. Because of his early life experience, James had difficulties in assessing risk and judging character. He was very vulnerable to being groomed. He was raped and was contacted sexually transmitted infections, which led to his hospitalisation. This further damaged his esteem and his vulnerability increased. James is now receiving support to help him recognise and build positive relationships and to reduce his feelings of isolation and inadequacy. These are only two of the many accounts from young people that the committee received. And I would urge all members here today to read the other testimonies we received. And for the avoidance of doubt, Presiding Officer, these accounts are all from Scottish young people. The experience they told us about the crimes committed against them all happened here in Scotland. One of the deficiencies of research that does exist is that there is very little evidence from young people themselves in the public domain. And clearly it's not because it doesn't exist. It is there. And there are organisations and bodies, mostly in the third sector, who pick up the pieces by providing counselling, support and practical assistance. So hearing from young people was a vital part of the committee's inquiry. However, while sadly there's no shortage of young people who've been sexually exploited in Scotland, the young people themselves were understandably reluctant to come forward to speak to us. The agencies we had listed to help us, to assist us, were keen to help, but for understandable reasons such as shame, embarrassment, fear or a desire to forget, young people were not willing to be in direct contact with us. The case studies we received were all anonymised and provided via the service providers. I'd like to record my thanks to them for having helped us get the voices of young people out there and into the chamber here this afternoon. The second stage of evidence gathering was directed more at statutory bodies. We also asked them a series of specific questions. By doing this, we were able to ensure that the evidence was received directly, addressed the issues we'd identified in the inquiry remit as being our scrutiny priority. We received 38 written submissions, all of which provided considered views. But what was notable is that a number of identical issues rose time after time. The first one I'd like to talk about, Presiding Officer, is the definition of child sexual exploitation. And none of us in the Chamber today can fail to have heard about some of the ways in which children can be sexually exploited. You only have to pick up a newspaper, turn on the radio or the TV to hear about another case which has come to light, where impressionable young people have been sexually exploited. And I should emphasise at this point, this is not just girls who are exploited, but boys too, have been groomed by older people, by gangs, groups, or befriended by peers who have ended up being exploited sexually. Most of the recent cases that have been reported have been in England. It's shocking to you the details, some of now which are only coming to light. And it's very important that the lessons taken from these cases are learnt regardless of whether the lessons are from England, in fact, Northern Ireland or elsewhere. We increasingly live in a border...
Margaret Mitchell.
Aware that survivors of childhood sexual abuse very much welcome the report. However, in focusing on child exploitation, which includes victims of childhood sexual abuse, does the convener consider there's a need to emphasise that the majority of the perpetrators of childhood sexual abuse are known to the family, in a position of trust, or even members of the family, whereas childhood exploitation tends to take place outside the family circle?
I think the member makes some very interesting points, and I'll be very happy to come along to the members' cross-party group in April and perhaps go through in a lot more detail that very points. So thank the member for the intervention. And it's very important that lessons learned from these cases are learned regardless, as I said, whether lessons are from England, Northern Ireland or elsewhere. We increasingly live in a borderless world where the internet and social networking sites, these crimes are not confined to any one particular geographic area, and new ways in which young people could become prey for those who seek to sexually exploit them are emerging all the time. At the moment in Scotland, the definition, as I said, is laid down from 2003, and I quote, Presiding Officer, any involvement of a child or young person below 18 in a sexual activity which remuneration of cash or in kind is given to a young person or a third party or persons. The perpetrator will have power over the child by virtue of one of the following: age, emotional maturity, gender, physical strength, intellect and economic and other resources, for example, access to drugs, unquote. So this is the definition that has been used by those tasked with tackling these crimes in Scotland. But does the definition really capture all the many ways that child sexual exploitation can manifest? Does everyone agree the definition is still relevant and capture the different forms it can take? Clearly, in order to tackle it, we all need to know what it is and can be able to recognise it. There needs to be a common understanding among young people themselves, among parents, carers, the professionals and the public of what forms sexual exploitation can take. It would appear from the evidence received by the committee that there is not a common understanding. There is confusion around what sexual exploitation is. Must it always involve an exchange of cash or in kind? If it doesn't, does that mean that it is not recognised or recorded as child sexual exploitation? What about the situations when a young person is coerced into sexual exploitative practices due to desire to fit in or be accepted? There may well not be an exchange of money or cash in kind, but due to the strong desire to fit in or perhaps to come across as being more mature, a young person might be vulnerable to being sexually exploited. In terms of definitions, child sexual exploitation is a form of child abuse. However, I know from evidence we've received from some organisations, including NSPCC, do not see and do not support any distinction between child abuse and child sexual exploitation. So what we have is a situation in which there is no united view on whether there should be a distinction, much less on what child sexual exploitation looks like, and what it is and how to recognise it. Partly for this reason, the committee's overarching recommendation in this report is that a national comprehensive strategy is required. The national strategy needs to include an updated definition, one that recognises the extent of which online activity is now part of all our lives and the risks that can be presented to our young people. It also needs to provide direction to ensure that best practice is shared and to coordinate the action required to do that. This action will include training, public awareness raising, addressing young people's vulnerabilities and ensuring the necessary services are supported and sustainable. And talking about sustainable services, let me talk about the issue of refuges in the next few seconds before I conclude for young people. Around 9,000 young people go missing in Scotland each year. Two of the case studies received by the committee illustrate only too starkly the connection for young people who run away from home and the risks of sexual assault and exploitation. I do propose them to detail here, but they're recounted in the committee's report. Since 1995, our legislation has made provision for refuges for the under-16s. However, very few were ever established, and very little use of them was made by statutory agencies. As of last year, Scotland only had one, in the Glasgow area run by Aberlour. We were told by Aberlour that they tried to work with local authorities and other relevant agencies, including the police, to encourage referrals, but it was felt there had not been an understanding of the value of the refuge, and sadly last year we heard that the refuge had been shut down because it was no longer viable. We do not get to the heart of why the refuge was not closed, but we've called this to be investigated further, and the Minister may want to comment this in her wind-up. There are just a few of the issues before the committee's report that I wanted to highlight in my opening remarks. I await hearing others' contributions with interest, and I'm looking forward in particular to the Minister's contribution. I commend the committee's report to Parliament, and I move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Aileen Campbell. Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to David Stewart and also to the rest of the members of the Public Petitions Committee for their comprehensive work on child sexual exploitation. And it's a debate that stretches beyond the Chamber, and I welcome the important contributions their report makes to this wider debate, as well as Bernardo's determination to bring that public debate before Parliament. Now, almost exactly a year ago, I spoke at a Holyrood Child Protection Conference at a time when stories of abuse and exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society were starting to be heard. Stories of children and young people exploited for their simple need for love and affection. Stories of those who could not speak to anyone about what they were suffering, too often denying what was being done to them and rejecting the very support and protection that could end their misery. And like everyone here in this chamber felt the first time that we heard about what had happened in Rotherham or Rochdale or what Jimmy Savile had done, I felt a mixture of horror, of anger and of sadness, and above all, the overwhelming need to act and to act quickly. And that's why I set up the Ministerial Working Group on Child Sexual Exploitation to harness rapidly that collective need to address this issue, using the expertise of the services that work most closely with the victims of child sexual exploitation. Local authorities, the Crown Office and the police, inspection bodies and key children's organisations such as Children in Scotland, Aberlour and Bernardo's. And that group reported to ministers in December, and I have asked it to continue monitoring the work in Scotland around child sexual exploitation. The group endorsed much of the work already underway in Scotland, but like today's report from the committee, it saw that more could be done and there was absolutely no room for complacency. Perhaps most importantly, the group recognised that child sexual exploitation is not a standalone issue, one that can be fixed through a series of eye-catching initiatives. Sexual exploitation is one of the most vile forms of child abuse and one of the most pernicious attacks on a child's and young person's well-being. So for those reasons, we need to ensure that we have in place the strongest approach to child protection and to supporting our children's well-being. Now, over the past few years, that has been our ambition with child protection. We have modernised our unique children's hearing system through new legislation. We undertook a major review of our child protection procedures and produced new child protection guidance, which we are further refreshing with a dedicated section on child sexual exploitation. We developed Scotland's first comprehensive risk assessment toolkit to help professionals identify signs of abuse and neglect. And we're working with Bernardo's on dedicated tools to better identify sexual exploitation. And at the same time, we are putting in place a unique, internationally lauded approach to placing children's and young people's well-being at the centre of service design, planning and delivery. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell members about getting it right for every child, nor indeed how, with the Children and Young People Bill, all children and young people up to the age of 18 will have access to a named person, someone who can pick up and act on the signs of potential abuse. And for those with particular needs and vulnerabilities, how services will now have to plan and work together to support the child and young person through a child's plan. Yes, of course.
Mitchell.
Earlier she mentioned the Rochdale case in Greater Manchester, and there it was the NHS crisis intervention team that helped expose the abuse. Given that, will there be a concerted effort to ensure that healthcare providers are alert and able to recognise sexual coercion, as opposed to assuming that young people are involved in consensual yet still illegal sexual relationships?
Minister.
I thank Margaret Mitchell clearly for an interest that she has in working to ensure that some of the issues that we're discussing today are dealt with adequately. And I mentioned that we have done a number of pieces of work to refresh guidance. Also, we've published the National Framework for Child Protection, Learning and Development, which was published in November in 2012, the Risk Assessment Framework published in November 2012, and more specifically to the point around health professionals, we published updated the Pink Book, which is for health professionals around child protection issues, and that was published in December 2012. So hopefully together many of those issues that you describe around how we can empower and help health professionals will be captured in that Pink Book which was published just over a year ago. Now, we'll also need to keep under review the services that directly support those experiencing child sexual exploitation. We need to know what services can have the best impact and how they can be sustained within a service framework that must address a wide range of child protection issues. And we also need to understand why some services, not least refuges for runaways, have struggled to remain sustainable. So I'll be asking the Ministerial Working Group on Child Sexual Exploitation to explore how we can better understand and promote the most effective services to support these children and young people, and hopefully that will give some comfort to the committee and the convener in his remarks around further investigating issues around refuges. Now, against that backdrop of how we are addressing the needs of children and young people overall, we have already taken a range of actions across government to address child sexual exploitation. We've committed to understanding the issue better. Like the committee, we recognise the gaps in our knowledge of this abuse. We commissioned the University of Bedfordshire to examine the scale and nature of child sexual exploitation in Scotland. We've also supported work to improve local ways of identifying and collating information on child sexual exploitation cases to local level, currently being piloted in the Forth Valley, and there will be other areas that may require more research, and we will continue to review such research needs. We're working to ensure all local areas have procedures and protocols in place to address child sexual exploitation. In the National Child Protection Guidance, we will set out our expectations that every local area has such a protocol and will develop a national good practice model. Schools also have a particularly important role to identify and prevent child sexual exploitation, and national work is helping support that. Children and young people receive education on topics such as developing appropriate relationships, protection from abuse, keeping themselves safe from harm from early on in their education, right up until the point they leave school. In this context, the work on improving internet safety among children and young people is absolutely critical. And in early December, the Minister for Learning, Science and Languages and myself chaired a summit on internet safety, drawing in experts from education, the third sector, the private sector and law enforcement bodies. And in that membership, we also had Jackie Brock, who is involved with the Ministerial Working Group to ensure there is a sequencing of knowledge and about what action we need to take. And they put forward a set of recommendations that I've asked the Scottish Stakeholder Group on internet safety to develop into a series of practical actions that will be reported back to ministers before the end of this year.
Yes. Jill Patterson.
There is a view that's starting to be heard that rather than police forces and taxpayers and volunteer groups are the people who investigate the actions of people on the internet, that the providers themselves should have the responsibility by law, in law, and that the cost attached to that should be taken off their bottom line rather than the taxpayers' bottom line, some companies desist from taking action on sites that are quite openly there for people, young children, to engage in?
Minister.
Well, there's an awful lot of different issues that are around internet safety, and that's why we held and hosted the summit last year. I think not least some of the incidents that happened last summer, which were particularly tragic. So there's clearly a need that we need to ensure young people and parents themselves are empowered in how to use the internet safely, and that was why we brought together a number of stakeholders around the table to discuss what we need to do to ensure that safety is maintained. But there are issues around the reserved nature of some of the regulation around internet use. But certainly where we have a responsibility, we are trying to do what we can to allow young people to use the internet in a safe way, because it's a great tool, it's a wonderful thing to have access to, but we need to make sure safety is paramount for young people. And parents know a wee bit more about what their children and young people are doing. But, of course, child sexual exploitation is also a crime, one that cannot be tolerated, and it's important that we do all we can to ensure that the perpetrators of these terrible crimes are brought to justice and their risk properly managed both in custody and in the community. And a critical element of this is our new single police force. Protecting the public, in particular the most vulnerable in Scotland's communities, is a key priority for Police Scotland. Another essential part of this is having the right legal framework to pursue these crimes. We've strengthened the law around sex crimes by bringing in the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009. This modernised the law, replacing a confusing and complex patchwork of common law and statutory offences that were developed over many decades with a single statutory framework. We've also improved Scotland's sexual offences prevention orders and risk of sexual harm orders regimes by expanding the range of conditions that a court may attach to an order. These orders are available to assist with the management of sex offenders and individuals without a relevant conviction who are assessed as posing a risk of sexual harm. In addition, the Crown Office has developed a team of expert prosecutors in the National Sexual Crimes Unit, specialising in the investigation and prosecution of serious sexual crimes. We understand the frustration of those who want to do more in this difficult area of crime detection and prosecution. A single dedicated police force and a Crown Office with specialist expertise can build on our robust legal framework and make important strides in disrupting these crimes in the future. But we will continue to review how the laws are being used and how practice can be improved. So finally, Presiding Officer, I want to turn to the question of whether we need a national child sexual exploitation strategy. And if that means, however, yet another time-consuming review of what we have done, then I don't think so. We have had a review of what we are and should be doing, and I believe we know what needs to be done. What we need to do is act upon it, and I'll be asking the Ministerial Working Group to corral this collective effort within a national action plan, a document focused on the real and practical things we are and must continue to do in this area. So finally, once again, I'd like to thank Dave Stewart and the committee for their work, and hopefully we can work together as we kind of try and ensure young people's safety in Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Jane Baxter. Up to 8 minutes, please, Ms. Baxter.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Public Petitions Committee for their work in producing the report we are debating today. Myself and my Labour colleagues join with members across the Chamber in recognising that abuses of power and exploitation of vulnerable young people should always be condemned. The personal case studies accompanying the committee's reports, which have been provided by the third sector organisations who work so closely with vulnerable and exploited young people, are truly harrowing and show how important it is that we tackle this issue effectively. With that in mind, it was reassuring that in an extremely sensitive and complex area, the report has carefully drawn out several major strands in its findings. The recommendations from the Public Petitions Committee's inquiry are extensive and are well thought out. I welcome them being given the consideration they deserve today, and Scottish Labour supports the majority of the findings which have been published. As we have heard, the report arose from a petition to the committee in July 2011 from Bernardo, Scotland, calling for research into child sexual exploitation and the need for new Scottish Government guidelines. The Cut Them Free campaign from Bernardo's is to be congratulated for its effectiveness in highlighting this issue and its role in driving the committee's inquiry. I also acknowledge that the Ministerial Short Life Working Group, about whose findings we've already heard from the Minister, has been helpful in drawing together a brief analysis of the existing provision in Scotland and elsewhere to tackle child sexual exploitation. However, as the report notes, there are a number of areas where further work or research could be undertaken. As the committee's report has highlighted, over the past few years, there have been a number of bodies, working groups, reports and reviews into child sexual exploitation, yet there are still gaps in our knowledge of this issue. And so, while I also welcome the intention of the Short Life Ministerial Working Group to meet in the future to review on any developments, I'm particularly keen to see that this does so in response to the committee's overarching recommendation for the establishment of a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation. The Ministerial Short Life Working Group noted that child protection is everyone's responsibility. It is our collective responsibility to keep our children and young people safe, but we must avoid the risk of collective responsibility leading to a lack of accountability for government and its agencies. So I was reassured to read the committee's careful consideration of the definition of child sexual exploitation. It is this understanding from the committee which has been so important in aiding the development of its numerous recommendations, especially those focusing on preventative measures and the improved education and safeguarding of our young people in the future. The sensitivities of tackling child sexual exploitation are many, and while the report acknowledges that this exists as a part of a continuum of child sexual abuse, the committee also recognises the need to focus on the area of sexual exploitation specifically, and I'm heartened that it reflects this in the recommendations for a national strategy. The report urges a more coordinated, less piecemeal approach in taking these issues forward. I believe this to be vital, and the expectation of the committee that the Scottish Government should report regularly to Parliament on its progress is similarly important. Although it seems that much of the work which has been taken forward in the past on this issue has not apparently been well coordinated, there have been some examples of excellent work produced, including the scoping study by the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland, commissioned by the Care Inspectorate to improve the way they inspect services. Because of the recent scrutiny by the Education Committee as part of the ongoing Children and Young People's Bill, has highlighted just how vulnerable many of our young people can be and how often they can be let down by the very systems which should be looking after them. The Celsus research found that a prevalence of child sexual exploitation of at least 25% would seem likely for children in the care population, and an expectation exists that this figure only increases for older children, girls and for children placed in residential care. But the data we have on child sexual exploitation in Scotland is variable, and the need to fill in the gaps in information is one of the key recommendations of the report. Worryingly, it seems there are few children over the age of 12 on child protection registers in Scotland, and I strongly support the recommendation of the report for a policy investigation into why this is the case. The vulnerability of older children and teenagers to sexual exploitation is clear, and the report effectively highlights the increasing normalisation of sexualised behaviour among young people. The report's recommendations on developing education programmes on internet dangers are also to be welcomed, as well as a recognition of the need to challenge stereotype behaviours which impact on young people, especially women, and can make them vulnerable to exploitation. In closing, Presiding Officer, I wish to put on record again my thanks to the hard work of the committee in undertaking this inquiry, and I look forward to hearing from members across the chamber for the rest of the afternoon's debate.
Many thanks. And I now call on Jackson Carlow. Up to 8 minutes, please, Mr Carlow.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I thank David Stewart for his opening speech introducing the committee report, and also add my thanks to those who gave evidence, the clerks and others who made this report possible. This is a difficult report discussing and seeking to make recommendations as it does on a most difficult subject. What became immediately clear to the committee, and what then led inexorably to the report's primary and overarching recommendation, is that understanding and policy are essentially adrift in a sea of competing work by seemingly uncoordinated, if well-intended, agencies, initiatives and interventions. There is a compelling common sense which underpins the conclusion that the Scottish Government should develop a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation. And this is not to suggest that there is a dash of amateurism about the efforts others have been making. Far from it. It is clear that there is a very considerable experience and depth of commitment on the part of organisations such as Bernardo's and others, and by individuals. However, it became immediately clear that across the UK, a myriad of inquiries, reviews and investigations are currently in progress. They will all surely in themselves be... Yes, of course.
Aileen MacLeod.
I would respond, and I think the fact that I've said, okay, we would want to make sure that we can take all the learning that we have and ensure that we have an action plan to make sure that we can take action as opposed to having another prolonged review. The Aberlour briefing has agreed with that position, thinking that there is a need now to take action as opposed to having yet another prolonged review and then, then at that point acting. And that's the point that Aberlour and both Bernardos have made.
I'm actually agreeing with you. So, I'm not giving a false impression. I agree. I think that any national strategy has to be one, and I welcome what you said, based on actions. And if that's what it's about, then fine. I agree. The last thing we need is now some further additional comprehensive review. They will all surely, these various reviews, be useful in themselves. However, it is only within the structure of a national strategy that the various conclusions, and even more basically the understanding of a definition, will achieve a clarity of purpose and direction. The danger with a small d is that on a subject of intense sensitivities, politicians who, unless themselves coming from a background of professional experience, and some do, are inevitably at least several steps removed from the realities of the issue. And the danger is that they wade in with calls for specific actions and specific recommendations which might make for much action and activity but be misplaced in their purpose. The report notes, for example, that the automatic desire of the committee to meet with those who have been affected and to examine that first-hand experience proved impossible, and for fully understandable reasons. Deeply affected and mistrusting, those who have suffered are suspicious and in many cases too vulnerable still to be subjected to the ham-fisted public or even private examination of well-intentioned politicians. And so it is testimony at second hand which the committee has drawn and which Dave Stewart to some extent detailed in his speech. It's still compelling, but it's nonetheless not as satisfactory. As David Stewart has noted, the intention of the committee was to be helpful. It was therefore careful not to embrace a remit that would see it chasing shadows down dozens of avenues, and in consequence has produced a series of practical recommendations and allowed others through its work to ask other searching questions. Not least, for example, why is it that there has been such an underuse of provisions of the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009 and the Protection of Children Prevention of Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2005. On the other hand, the recommendations of the report do somewhat casually stray into one popular area of policy recommendation for politicians: education. In so many areas of policy, whether public health or whatever, as politicians we have become fond of recommending that schools and teachers should take the lead, and in a somewhat generalised way. This report does to an extent too, and I'm less persuaded by this. For the more we have introduced and enhanced the detail of sexual education into the school curriculum, it is impossible to demonstrate that we have been successful in our intent. We still have alarmingly high rates of teenage pregnancy, of sexually transmitted disease, and of ever-reducing age of reported sexual intimacy. We've provided no end of facts, of practical routes for further assistance and support. Yet in an effort not to obstruct, we have eschewed context and value in the opinion of many. If we are to seek to make a valued educational contribution, it must be one which ensures that we do not counterintuitively promote a greater instance of that which we are seeking to curtail and prevent. Moreover, what the report identifies is the all too depressing instance amongst those children already in lives that demonstrate recognisable chaotic factors. At no point does the report talk about families or parents as a positive source of support, and I think this is an oversight. Annabel Goldie talked in the last Parliament about parenting, and in terms of education, we should not ignore the education of parents, the majority of whom will have no experience themselves, but who are deeply concerned by the modern world and the opportunities for evil which exist within it. I know of many parents who will be regularly confronted with newspaper or magazine case histories, sometimes willingly sensationalised for reasons we all recognise and deplore. This can alert parents to a particular tragedy without offering them validated best practice for the well-being of their own children. There is a case for ensuring that any national strategy looks to produce for parents helpful and informed guidance endorsed by government. Otherwise, they rely on the anecdotal, and in so doing can seem removed to children from the realities of their world. Frankly, the world has moved on at such a pace that saying, well, my mother always used to say, or we won't discuss this further and you will not do, really no longer suffice. Parents need evolving, sensible and practical advice. It can also seem in the publication of a report that the issue in hand is endemic among the whole population, when in fact the vast majority remain unaffected. The sexual exploitation of children has become widely discussed, just as child abduction has in the past. It is not in any sense a marginal issue, and the report details in the most authoritative, harrowing at times, in fact, way it can, the all too often inexplicable dark side of human behaviour. What I'm seeking to say is that any strategy must not become so diluted to be national as to lose bite and focus in its rooting out of actual child sex exploitation, or the support of those affected, or the effective prosecution of those who exploit. I welcome the recommendations on police education, on the named support of an individual acting on behalf of children involved in the legal process, on the training of frontline police officers to disrupt perpetrators, and on the greater use of sexual harm orders, and more generally on the effective implementation and use of legal remedies already available. I believe this debate is also an opportunity to pay tribute to the many that have, with the greatest sensitivity, immersed themselves in understanding the world in which this activity takes place, in order to lead those traumatised and damaged by it to a safer future. So I do thank Bernardo's, NHS Open Road Who Cares, Scotland, Abelard Childcare Trust, Say Women, for example, among the dozens of organisations and individuals who act and from whom written and oral evidence was received. And of them, I too, like Dave Stewart, think it worth pausing to reflect on the closure, even as the work of the committee progressed, of Scotland's only refuge for children who have run away from home, operated by Abelard in the Glasgow area. The loss of this three-bedroom unit is surely by any standard a regressive step, and I hope that further work will be done to establish why this was not sustainably viable. Presiding Officer, were the central recommendation of this report to fall on deaf ears that a national strategy be established, that it is impossible to conclude other than that child exploitation will continue without our proper understanding of its extent, evolution, or the effectiveness of any of the actions already taken or envisaged. Countless groups will work on, each gathering further understanding, but without the authority which a coordinated approach may bring. This is a report in which politicians have tried, with reticence and humility in terms of our understanding and experience, to advance a policy agenda for the good of those affected and against those who perpetrate evil. It is for government to step in and provide leadership, to draw on that experience and talent of those who do have the experience and commitment. And I welcome the Minister's focus on actions rather than further reviews. This then is a report bristling with practical common sense suggestions, which I hope Parliament will commend to the Scottish Government tonight for action.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate. We have a little time in hand. I can offer David Torrance to be followed by Graham Pearson. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by thanking the committee clerk and team for their hard work and their effort in helping us put together a report. I'd also like to thank the numerous organisations, individuals and public bodies who have been involved in the committee's inquiry into child sexual exploitation in Scotland. The contributions and the evidence you have provided have proved invaluable and have allowed the committee to conduct what is, I believe, an in-depth examination of the current measures in place to both prevent and tackle the sexual exploitation of children in Scotland. I'd like to extend particular gratitude to Bernardo Scotland, who submitted the public petition providing the impetus behind our inquiry. Your engagement with the committee has been crucial, and I commend you for your organisation for raising this important issue in the context of the Scottish Parliament. The sexual exploitation of children has become a more prominent issue in recent years, largely due to extensive media coverage of child exploitation gangs in various parts of the UK. This has instigated a greater focus on the issue in Scotland. However, I believe that more must be done to improve the ability of services to identify both victims and potential victims of child sexual exploitation, to support these children and to target the predators. The committee's report makes clear that data collection on the prevalence of child sexual exploitation in Scotland is inconsistent and under-resourced, and that there is a need for improved data collection tools in this regard. However, of the information that is available, I was shocked to learn that many of the estimates for prevalence are relatively high. For example, according to a case study research undertaken by a Centre of Excellence for the Looked After Children in Scotland, around 1 in 4 children in care are victims of child sex exploitation, and that this figure is expected to be considered higher for some of the most vulnerable groups. This alone indicates that we have much to learn as a nation about how to tackle this difficult crime. One of the areas on which I would like to focus is the need for more widespread and comprehensive preventive education amongst young people. In today's society, children are increasingly socialised into believing certain negative stereotypes about boys and girls, about what is normal behaviour in terms of sexual relationships. We need to address this attitude at an early stage in order to reduce risk of children thinking that it is normal or acceptable for anyone to coerce them into engaging in sexual behaviour. Whilst there are already some examples of good practice in schools of educating children about healthy relationships, mutual respect and sexual boundaries, the committee has found that there is a need to expand such practices much more widely into educational institutions and other youth settings across Scotland. The committee has been aware of some of the excellent educational resources, such as those produced by Bernardo Scotland, that are already freely available, many of which can be readily accessed via NWG Network's website. Another aspect of the report I would like to highlight is the lack of therapeutical and emotional support services available constantly throughout Scotland for young people affected by sexual exploitation. The committee has found, through the course of our inquiry, that many young people feel they have no one they can trust to confide in. It appears that there is often a general mistrust of social care workers amongst victims due to fear of being judged and labelled, which may be down to a lack of training and awareness in the sector. We need to try to break down these barriers, or at least ensure the availability of alternative services, such as Childline, which can offer valuable support when children feel they have nowhere else to turn. Connected on this issue is the provision of refuge for those who have broken free from child sexual exploitation and need a temporary base whilst they make contact with services that can help them. The committee was informed that Scotland's only refuge of this variety for under-16s, run by Aberlour and Glasgow area, closed down in June 2013. There has been no such facility in place since. The availability of a safe place to go many significantly increases the likelihood of victims to seek help, and may also play a key role in preventing the re-entry of children into sexual exploitation circles. I therefore strongly support the committee's recommendation that consideration should be given to placing a duty on all local authorities to provide a suitable refuge for the victims of child sexual exploitation. The final matter I would like to address today is that of the role of the first sector in preventing and tackling child sexual exploitation. Throughout the course of our inquiry, it has become overwhelmingly clear that charities and voluntary organisations make a significant contribution in this area. I believe that more must be done to acknowledge this and to support these organisations to continue the work they do. Time and time again, we have heard evidence which suggests that, without the support of organisations like Bernardo's, 18 and Under, Who Cares Scotland and many others, victims of child sexual exploitation would not have been able to break free from the abuse. The first sector organisations appear to have enhanced ability to build trust with young people who, as a result, are more likely to engage with other support services. We should use that expertise and experience of the third sector to coordinate our efforts to tackle child sexual exploitation at a national level. A major element of this is the need to improve intelligence sharing in relation to alleged perpetrators between police and the first sector, and in an area which these organisations still have a distinct advantage due to their capacity to gain the trust of victims. Good working examples of such practice include partnerships between Bernardo Scotland and the Police in Renfrewshire, as well as the multi-agency approach adopted by Glasgow Child Protection Committee. If we can further develop coordinated with the third sector across the board, it seems likely that we will see significant benefits both in the terms of outcomes of children and the identification and the rate of prosecution of offenders. Being a member of the Public Petitions Committee, conducting this inquiry has been both harrowing and a rewarding experience for me. Whilst it has been very upsetting to hear some of the evidence of the young people who have been subjected to sexual exploitation in Scotland, I have also been reassured that there is good work currently being done up and down the country to help protect vulnerable children. What remains clear from our investigation is that more needs to be done to coordinate the actions of all agencies involved with regard to data collection, preventative education, training for those in the care industry and provision of therapeutic services for young people and law enforcement. In order to achieve this, I fully support the committee's recommendation that the Scottish Government develop a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation. In doing so, I am positive that we can make improvements to the service we provide nationally to ensure that every child, regardless of where they live in Scotland, has equal access to support they need to avoid becoming a victim of child sexual exploitation and to deal with the consequences if they do. May I extend my gratitude once again to all those involved in the committee's inquiry and ask that those of you in the Chamber today join me in recommending this report to the Scottish Government. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by John Wilson. 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I begin my contribution by offering my thanks, sincere thanks, to three separate entities in this debate. First of all, to Barnados for bringing forward the evidence that lay behind the petition, which resulted in the report that we now debate. Secondly, to Aberlour and all the other groups who are involved long-term in dealing with the problems that we face in terms of child sexual exploitation. And I specifically mention Aberlour to give me the opportunity to add my regret to the comments made earlier in this debate in relation to the decision that was taken in 2013 to withdraw funding for the one refuge that was available in Scotland that may have helped children who suffered exploitation. I'm therefore pleased that the Minister has indicated in her contribution that there will be a re-examination of that situation, and I look forward to the outcome from her examination. Finally, I would acknowledge the work of the Public Petitions Committee, who have undertaken a very challenging investigation of a subject matter which is deeply important to the future of Scotland and our young people, and a report which I think has dealt sensitively with the issues which arose in that regard. Only this morning I received a telephone call from a constituent that I've dealt with for some months. Unbeknownst to him, this debate was ongoing in the chamber today. And for the last few months, I've attempted to deal with some of the issues that he brought to my attention, which came and initiated from a period of betrayal that he suffered whilst in the care and being protected as a child when he suffered sexual exploitation. Many decades later, he's still dealing with the pain, the regret and the isolation that has come from that experience. And without going into the detail of his particular case, I think it mirrors the experience of many children and adults who exist in our community and who have to deal with these matters day in, day out, and see very often little escape and not sufficient support. In that context, I would remind the Chamber and the Minister of the main detail undertaken by the inquiry into this subject matter to identify the nature and extent of child sexual exploitation in Scotland, a matter that we should still pay attention to and continue work, to identify the most pertinent issues that need to be addressed, and again, I think a changing scene that needs addressing on a year-by-year basis, and to continue to make recommendations on how to improve the effectiveness of our services. Scottish studies are few and far between, so the sheer extent and the nature of this subject matter is little known to us, and much is being guessed at on the basis of the work and efforts of those engaged in this area of activity. I have no doubt that the Minister will acknowledge in closing the need for greater research in this area and the need to understand clearly the beginnings and how this exploitation develops in a country such as Scotland. At a UK level, the Centre for Exploitation and Online Protection have engaged in some measure of research, although I think it would be acknowledged to be very limited in its aspect. But even at a UK-wide, into which Scottish police forces have fed, it was acknowledged that in 2008-9, nearly 5,500 reports had been received in relation to exploitation of children. A year later, that 5,500 had risen above 6,000 reports, 6,291. We are perhaps in some position of advantage in that the new head of that centre, CEOP, is a former police officer from Scotland, Johnny Gwynn, who will have an interest in what happens here in Scotland, and I have no doubt Mr Gwynn will be supported by Gordon Meldrum and Bob Lauder, both former members of Scottish Police Service who equally operate at a high level within the National Crime Agency. But the report from CEOP also acknowledged that 27% of girls reported that they had been forced to and pressurised to engage in sexual activity against their wishes. There's a real problem here for girls in our community that need to be addressed and addressed urgently. What we do know is who some of these high-risk groups will be. They come from families who are facing difficulties where abuse and domestic violence is part of daily life and neglect. They also come from those who are within our care system. And unfortunately, across the United Kingdom, we know that children within our care systems, where the management are not disciplined and effective in the way they manage the care environment, these children can be abused either by their own peer group within the home or, unfortunately, on occasions by those who are given the duty to look after them. We need to address that problem, and it's an ongoing problem that we recognise. Those who would seek to exploit children will also seek out the posts that make that exploitation so much easier. And I would hope that the Minister, in taking this matter forward, will pay some attention to that element of the problem we face. The action plan or national strategy that the Minister has indicated is vitally important in taking forward this issue. Not a great deal has been said about internet and the use of chat rooms, and indeed reports most recently that over 10,000 children are exploited in the Far East by adults who exist and conduct their business here. If Presiding Officer is happy.
Yes.
I realise that you were quite so far on. However, it was just to point out that we did hold and host an Internet Summit last year with a view to making sure that the momentum we built up there does allow us to continue to make sure that we can allow the safe internet use for children and young people, but also to make sure that parents are empowered and have the knowledge about what their children may be facing when they use chat rooms and social media sites.
I thank the Minister for that intervention. I'm happy to acknowledge that. The use of these internets to choreograph the exploitation of children through chat room is a new development and indicates how quickly this scene moves, and we need to pay attention. My final brief comment is to acknowledge that there isn't a lot in the report about prison policy and what we should do with those who reoffend and are in our custody to persuade them to avoid reoffending in the future. And on that point, I will conclude. Thanks, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call on John Wilson to be followed by Liam MacArthur. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Public Petitions Committee since 2008, I found this petition one of the most challenging as a member of that committee, given the subject matter we were discussing. Can I say at the start, I would like to thank Bernardo Scotland for submitting the petition. I'd also like to thank the clerks, Dr Sarah Nelson, who acted as the committee advisor on this issue, and all the witnesses who provided both written and oral evidence for consideration. But in particular, Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank the evidence from the young people who provided written evidence to the committee on their experiences, because without that evidence, I think we may have missed a vital element of what we're trying to do, not only as a parliament, but as a society, to address some of the issues raised by the young people. Presiding Officer, the petitioner, Bernardo Scotland, called for new research into the nature and scope of child sexual exploitation in Scotland. And the petition was considered at a time when there was a national spotlight on high-profile cases investigating allegations of child sexual exploitation, and the Minister made reference to the Savo inquiry, but also at a time when we were listening to national press reports on cases in towns and cities in England and elsewhere. The committee noted that there was also a number of working groups that had been established with researchers commencing work on this particular issue. But we still felt it was important that the Public Petitions Committee take on this issue and carry out its own investigation to ensure that we could add to that debate, but also to try and identify cross-cutting issues as a committee without referring it on to Education Committee or any other Justice Committee or whoever else. The committee considered ways to fully investigate the issues behind the petition, whether that is a detailed inquiry and report, as in this case, because we felt it required the report from the committee to be presented to this Parliament. In terms of this issue under discussion, child sexual exploitation, this is not an easy subject area and not a straightforward one in terms of finding a solution. Principally, there is good practice taking place in Scotland, but it is disjointed and lacking in key agencies taking a leadership role. As stated earlier, this is not a particularly comfortable subject, but sometimes the role of a Parliament and its committees is to highlight wrongdoing and demand action when appropriate, especially in terms of protecting the victims. The availability of data is critical into this difficult subject area and was noted by the National Working Group for Sexually Exploited Children and Young People in their visit to Scotland in October 2013. It reported that estimates gained from agencies dealing with young people accessing services could be anything from 64 to 300 on an annual basis. It found much concern about under-reporting, and in fact, this is a disquiet that I share. Others have stated the committee recommends that the Scottish Government develop a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation. And this is a strategy that has to bring together the different departments of government to ensure that we are tackling this in the most appropriate way. The Scottish Government were instrumental in commissioning the University of Bedfordshire to continue its work piloting, monitoring and self-evaluation tool with a particular local authority. The committee work in this area highlights the need to take some direct action, especially in relation to young people in residential care. We heard that there are intrinsic risks to looked after children, and evidence provided by Who Cares Scotland highlighted that the issue is becoming about the young person rather than the perpetrators who are involved with them. This clearly raises issues about the powers to protect young people, and these require further clarification, particularly for looked after children and the stigma associated. Therefore, the committee's recommendation that the Care Inspectorate should make a CSE a detailed area for inspection for local authorities and, in fact, all organisations accommodating children has to be welcomed. Other speakers in today's debate have already made reference to the fact that there are serious issues with respect to protecting vulnerable young people. No doubt the associated media coverage in recent months on the subject of young people being sexually abused has shone a light into the darker parts of society that, frankly, are too shocking or at times can be difficult to believe. The case studies provided to the committee by Bernardo's and 18 and Under certainly details the seriousness of problems associated with looked after children. The report highlights that the common perception of CSE is one of female victims and male perpetrators. Although the committee is well aware, and the convener made reference in his opening comments about a young male victim of sexual exploitation, that there are male victims, the public petitions, in light of the evidence presented, noted that Professor Stalker's evidence showed boys were disproportionately represented among disabled children and young people who had been abused, compared to abused young people without disabilities. And one of the recommendations I would draw the Minister's attention to in the report is the issue about the reporting where it is identified the young disabled children have been sexually abused. That normally that information is not in the official records that are kept. We would ask that those records be updated and that evidence be entered into those records so that we get a fuller picture of how young disabled children are being dealt with. As one of the key recommendations, the committee notes that a national strategy takes account of young men as a particular target group. Although the evidence was difficult to listen to, it in no way compares to the suffering that some of our young people in Scotland have to endure daily. More work with frontline voluntary sector organisations has to be done, because the evidence that came forward from the voluntary sector was compelling, and the work that they do on many occasions unrecognised by the statutory agencies. Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to raise awareness that more must be done to reduce instances of child sexual exploitation, and more importantly, bring an end to the child sexual exploitation in Scotland. I welcome the work already undertaken by the Minister and the Scottish Government. However, more needs to be done to ensure we rid society of this crime and ensure that perpetrators are dealt with in the most appropriate manner. I welcome this report.
Many thanks. Now call on Liam MacArthur to be followed by Angus MacDonald. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also acknowledge and congratulate David Stewart and his colleagues on the Petitions Committee for their work. I think it's undoubtedly a complex area. I think John Wilson was right on the money in pointing to how uncomfortable this must have been for the committee at times. The harrowing and distressing case studies that David Stewart alluded to in his remarks, I think couldn't have failed but touch anyone who had read them or listened to them in person. I mean, I was first made aware of the work of the Petitions Committee in this area through an application to the corporate body for agreement to support an extension of the work being done by the advisor. And what that told me was that it illustrated, in a sense, the complexity of the issues that the committee was trying to wrestle with, but also, I think, the determination of the committee to do justice to those issues. Could I also put on record my gratitude to Bernardo's? This, I think, is becoming a bit of a common refrain. On a personal level, it's becoming a common refrain from my work as a member of the Education Committee that has spent at least a couple of years looking at issues related to those going through our care system, and most recently through the work on the Children and Young People's Bill. But also, I think, recognising that it is the work of Bernardo's that has given rise to this inquiry through the original petition, and certainly they are instrumental in informing the deliberations thereafter. And I think the report that has emerged, the recommendations that have emerged from that process, are well balanced and much to be welcomed. The central call, I suppose, for a national overarching strategy does strike me as a sensible one. I was interested in the exchanges between the Minister and Jackson Carlo earlier on, where I think there was perhaps the perception more disagreement than there actually is. I think the Minister was quite right to point to the call from Aberlour to try and work with existing work streams, including the Short Life Ministerial Working Group, which the Minister's just confirmed will be extended to look at this. But I think, given the evidence of a lack of coordination there, I don't think we can dismiss that call for a national overarching strategy, pulling all of this work together. I confess that while I was obviously aware of concerns around child sexual exploitation, the sense that it's on the increase, the sense also that it's quickly developing in nature in the forms that it takes through online grooming and the opportunities afforded by chat rooms and social media. But it's not an area I felt I understood in any great detail, and I was, I think, reassured by the salutary warning from Jackson Carlo of well-intentioned politicians blundering in there armed with silver bullets. But I was also reassured by the committee's findings themselves, which I think pointed to an imperfect understanding of the issues, even no agreement on what constitutes child sexual exploitation in the first place. So I think the call for further an effort to build up understanding and awareness is absolutely essential through building on national data gathering and scoping exercises, but building up that awareness and understanding not just amongst the public, amongst children, parents, carers and the wider public, but also amongst the professionals involved. And again, I think the point about what appears to be an absence of adequate coordination is one we ought to take cognizance of. There are specific challenges laid down, of course, for example, to the police and justice bodies who the committee found appear to be not using to the fullest extent the relevant legislation that currently exists, not least to give effect to the disruption to perpetrators that a number of members have mentioned. I ought to perhaps acknowledge the valiant efforts of the Minister to point up this as a potential benefit of pulling together a single national police force, which on the back of the extended topical questions we had earlier on this afternoon seemed to be a brave endeavour indeed. But the committee also calls for engagement with children through education and the work in schools. And I listened with interest to what Jackson Carlo was saying in that respect, but I do believe that this is absolutely right. Apparently, consensual relationships are often anything but, and there is a lack of understanding amongst those being groomed what the signs of grooming actually are, not just amongst children, but also perhaps amongst teachers and parents and the like. But I think the way in which this is done is critically important. I have long had concerns about campaigns around stranger danger and the unintended consequences that can flow from that. I mean, the evidence suggests, I think the evidence the committee heard, is that much of the child sexual exploitation happens within families and within care settings, and therefore I think it would be wrong to overstress the extent to which those unknown to the individuals should be the focus of attention. There is the need to build confidence in children, to recognise the problems, to feel confident in dealing with them or knowing who to approach to help them deal with them, to build, I think, as David Stewart alluded to, a resilience within the individuals themselves. But there is a risk, I think, that we cultivate an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that ultimately could be counterproductive in trying to meet the objectives we're all intent on trying to meet. If I could make reference to the Children and Young People's Bill briefly, the Minister obviously has had an intimate involvement in this process, and I think the Minister was also right to point to some of the improvements that will be delivered through the passing of that legislation next month. But I'm conscious that Tam Bailey, the Children's Commissioner, but also the Coalition Together and other bodies have pointed to deficiencies in that bill in terms of the rights of children, particularly the failure to include Articles 3 and 12 of the UN CRC in that bill represents a missed opportunity. Those do point, for those less familiar with the UN CRC, Article 3 is ensuring the voice of the child is heard in all decisions that affect him or her, and Article 12 it reflects the best interests of the child are treated as the paramount consideration. So while I think very valuable steps are being taken through the bill, I think the failure to incorporate more fully those particular articles is a deficiency, and I think the report from the Petitions Committee simply reinforces that point. This is by no means a magic bullet in addressing an issue that is complex, pernicious, and is indeed evolving in its nature. On that basis, I congratulate again the Petitions Committee on not being put off by the scale of the task that took on, for grappling with this and coming forward with what I think are sensible recommendations. And I certainly look forward to hearing the Minister's concluding remarks, but I think we have the basis on which to address some of the shortcomings that the committee identified. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Now call on Angus MacDonald to be followed by Jamie Hepburn. 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I hope the Chamber will bear with me when I speak with a heavy cold, but also with a heavy heart as we debate this horrendous subject, which is a blight on our society, as well as societies throughout Europe and across the world. Clearly, in an ideal world, this debate would not be required. We wouldn't have to worry about child sexual exploitation, and we would not have a society which has to contend with issues such as systematic and complex sexual abuse within the home, child trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, grooming and forced marriage. Clearly, child sexual exploitation covers an extremely broad range of issues which engage a large number of agencies and organisations in their efforts to tackle and prevent CSE, which it is generally recognised is sadly a growing problem. However, we are where we are, and sadly our society still has to contend with the issue. I wasn't a member of the Public Petitions Committee when this petition was lodged by Bernardo's in July 2011. However, I joined the committee in time to take part in the visit to Bernardo's facility in Glasgow in September 2012, following which the committee agreed to hold the committee inquiry into the issue. And can I say how pleased I was to see at first hand the good work going on at Barnardo's in Glasgow in this regard, and I'm pleased to hear reports that it has growing positive relations with the local police and is now something of a model of best practice. Now, we know that there is good practice across Scotland, but it can be patchy and uncoordinated. It is recognised that child protection committees are best placed to collect and map data in their area, and where good practice is found, this information should be shared and, where possible, rolled out in other areas across Scotland. Perhaps at this point, Presiding Officer, can I also add my thanks to Barnardo's for highlighting their concerns to us through the Public Petitions Committee, and also can I thank the committee clerks, Spice, and the committee's advisor, Dr Sarah Nelson, for all their hard work during the course of the inquiry. Their help and assistance was invaluable, as was that of the agencies and organisations who gave evidence. We heard some harrowing and shocking evidence in the course of the lengthy inquiry. However, I for one certainly hope that the outcome will be a stronger focus by all agencies in tackling and preventing child sexual exploitation, with the aim of totally eradicating such a blight on our society. There is no quick fix, of course, and our inquiry certainly was never tasked with coming up with all the answers. Indeed, as our inquiry progressed, it became clearer that the issue was a complex and continually evolving one, particularly with the emergence of online concerns, as we've already heard this afternoon. We have, however, come up with a large number of salient recommendations, one of which is worth highlighting, and that is the recommendation that the Scottish Government, Police Scotland and all key agencies adopt a high commitment to disrupting perpetrators' activity and identifying those at risk. Associated with that, the committee recommends that mandatory training for frontline and specialist police officers on legislative options to disrupt perpetrators. The committee also recommends better police analysis and collation of information about and the tracking of abusive networks. Dealing with the monsters at the heart of the problem and disrupting their operation will go some way to reducing the current figures for CSE crimes. As we heard from Daljit Dagon from Barnardo's, in order to reduce child sexual exploitation effectively and to protect current and potential victims, it's necessary to take resolute action against the perpetrators of these crimes. Daljit Dagon spoke about what she called the triangle approach that Barnardo's have developed, whereby the focus is on the victim, but where there is also recognition that there's a child sex offender and a facilitator. She went on to say, when she addressed committee, that we have to flip the triangle over and focus on disrupting and prosecuting perpetrators, and we should identify locations and police them better so that we protect young people and prevent them from becoming involved in child sexual exploitation. However, the report also noted that one of the difficulties in disrupting perpetrators is the attitude of young people and those who witness CSE. Initiatives designed to challenge these attitudes face difficulties, not merely because perpetrators are skilled in operating under the radar, but because these crimes where young people often do not see themselves, these are crimes where young people often do not see themselves as victims, a situation we heard from a number of witnesses. Waiting for young people to complain could be an ineffective strategy for catching offenders, since it can often protect perpetrators, who initially treat them as special and may offer them alcohol, drugs, money and affection out of misplaced loyalty, fear or intimidation. And underuse of legislation doesn't help. The Protection of Children and Prevention of Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2005 creates a specific offence of child grooming and makes provision to apply to the court for a risk of sexual harm order, or an RSHO, where an individual is suspected of involvement in a course of conduct to groom a child. However, the committee heard that there is disquiet amongst practitioners that the 2005 Act is not well known and is not well used amongst police. In relation to this, children first expressed disquiet about low usage of existing legislation, and it calls in evidence for police to have additional mandatory training to highlight legislative options to disrupt and prosecute CSE offenders, which were actually echoed by Police Scotland itself. And I was pleased to hear the Minister endorse that view earlier on. In their evidence, Barnardo's called for the Children and Young People Scotland Bill to include tackling CSE and joint work with police to disrupt perpetrator activity as part of the proposals for children's service plans, and I would urge the Minister to consider taking that request on board as the bill progresses through Parliament. In closing, Presiding Officer, this Parliament will be failing the people of Scotland if the hidden problem of CSE is not properly tackled with a clear strategy. If our committee report and resultant action by government and associated agencies helps just one child to avoid the effects of CSE, then it's a job well done. But let's not stop until the nightmare has been eradicated completely. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Neil Bibby. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the committee for its work and also Bernardo's for their petition. David Stewart, in opening the debate, rightly described this. I think he described it as a dark corner of Scotland, and I don't think any of us can doubt how difficult and harrowing a subject matter this must have been for the committee to have dealt with. But I don't think there can be any more important subject matter for them to have considered. I think it would be very wrong to have ducked an issue just because it's difficult, and the committee is to be commended for taking this issue forward and bringing this debate to the chamber. As a father, indeed as a human being, it's incredible to me the physical and mental damage that some will inflict on children and young people. Jackson Carlo described this as the dark side of human behaviour. I think this is probably the very least we could describe it as. These are young people who deserve our protection to be able to live happy childhoods, and it's always depressing beyond expression when we hear of those who have been exploited. Recent revelations in the media have probably served to bring this issue to the fore, but sadly this is an issue that's long been with us, and indeed the number of case studies, the very depressing case studies that David Stewart alluded to that are set out in the report, different stories, different experience, but all of it a litany of testimony to the fact that child exploitation is a very real and present danger in Scotland today. Of course, the question for us, I suppose, as a Parliament is how do we support those who have been affected, and how do we tackle the incidents of child exploitation in the future? And I think the report has to be viewed as an important part of that work, and I welcome it in that context. The committee has made a number of recommendations. I think each are commendable in their own way, and I may touch upon some of them. And I don't think the Scottish Government has responded to the report yet, and I look forward to seeing their response. But I think it is clear that we have seen action from the Scottish Government to tackle the exploitation of children. The Minister has referred to the Short Life Ministerial Working Group. And indeed, that brings me to one of the recommendations. That there was a recommendation by the committee to have a review into the national strategy. Well, I know that the working group has essentially undertaken a series of work that has laid out a series of actions that should have to be taken forward to strengthen action addressing child sexual exploitation. And it seems to me that that's rather similar to what was requested by the committee. And I think the points that have been made about seeing action rather than another review have been well made. And indeed, we've seen other activity by the Scottish Government, such as the Summit on Internet Safety, the funding for Respect Me and Childline, and advice issued to schools in terms of encouraging safe and responsible use of mobile phone technology in school and beyond. So we do see that the Scottish Government has undertaken a range of measures to try and tackle this pernicious social ill. And in terms of responding to the petition itself, I know that one of the things that was called for in the petition was research into the nature and scope of child sexual exploitation in Scotland. Well, of course, we've seen the government commissioning the University of Bedfordshire to look at this work, and also the work that's going on in the pilot of Forth Valley that the Minister has referred to. So again, we see the government responding to the petition. I think in saying that, Presiding Officer, that we should recognise the difficulties that will always be, that will always exist in establishing the prevalence of child sexual exploitation. The victims are understandably reluctant to come forward. There is the concern of not being believed. There is often intimidation
and there is often misplaced shame. They are not the people who should feel ashamed, but often that is an issue, and I think that was reflected in the case studies. So there are difficulties then in establishing the exact scale of the problem, but I do agree that it is important to try and quantify this, and would welcome any efforts to do so. But I do think, and I consider it to be rather more important to try and tackle a problem rather than quantify it. After all, surely if one child is being exploited, then surely even that is a prevalence too high for our society to bear. How we tackle this has to be informed by involved in this area. I agreed with Jackson Carlaw's point. I may be paraphrasing it slightly differently, but I do think we do need to caution against a political class being seen to do something just because something needs to be done. We need to ensure the efficacy of any measures taken forward. In that regard, I want to highlight a few areas raised by outside groups within briefings that have been provided us ahead of the debate. And the first area is in the area of education. It is an area that was picked up by the committee, and the Commissioner for Children and Young People made, I think Liam MacArthur made the point about trying to place this work in the context of children's rights as set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Article 29 is the right to education. And the Commissioner points to recent research with young people in Scotland revealing worrying attitudes to sexual health and consent, and also issues of the sexual objectification of girls and young women, highlighting the need to tackle such attitudes. And they suggest that the Government's forthcoming update of its guidance in relationships, sexual health and parenthood education in schools provides one important opportunity to try and deal with education around these areas. Bernardo Scotland also made the same point, and indeed so did Aber Learn. I'd be interested to know the Scottish Government's perspective on these views and how we can better educate our young people to be safe. We also, I think, need to reflect on the fact that the problem manifests itself in different ways in different places, and the roles of child protection committees have to be viewed as important as well. And Bernardo's, in their submission, talked about how data could be shared rather better between child protection committees, which strikes me as an important point to make. And again, it would be useful to know how the Scottish Government is helping to facilitate this sort of information sharing. I want to close, President Officer, by talking about the role of parents in responding to concerns about child exploitation. I, as a father, consider it my responsibility, along with my wife, to ensure that my two children are aware of the dangers that exist, not to be overawed by them, not to be borne down by them, but to be aware of them. And I know that as parents we aim to ensure our young children grow up to have respect for themselves and respect for others, to see we're doing our best to try and bring them up in an environment that nourishes and cherishes them. And that, for me, is an important part of the challenge in tackling child exploitation. The role of the parent is critical, but we do know that despite the best efforts of parents, sometimes young people get drawn into circumstances we don't want them to. We know there are parents who are neglectful and even more beyond my comprehension are themselves sometimes the perpetrators of that exploitation. So it is right that we have a strategy to try and deal with child sexual exploitation. I commend the Public Petitions Committee in that regard. I hope that when we return to this subject matter, Presiding Officer, we can see further progress to tackle the exploitation of Scotland's young people.
Thank you very much. I now call on Neil Bibby to be followed by George Adam. Up to 7 minutes, please, now.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate. We often say debates are important, but I can't think of many debates more important than one on how we protect our children from harm and from sexual exploitation. I'd like to thank David Stewart and the other Public Petitions Committee members for their inquiry work in this area. I know they've spent a great deal of time investigating the causes of child exploitation and investigating the actions that governments, national, local and all relevant authorities need to take to prevent children from being sexually exploited. I'd also like to add my thanks to other members, to Bernardo's, for bringing forward this important petition in the first place. I was a member of the Petitions Committee from May to 2011, and I remember the petition when it was first being lodged, so it is clear that this has been a lengthy piece of work by the committee. The first thing I would say is that we all need to recognise this issue probably deserves more prominence than has been given in the past. I'm not saying that any organisation doesn't think it's an important issue, and I welcome the actions that the Scottish Government and Minister has set out, but I think it's fair to say it's not had the promise it requires until now, and that's why I think the Bernardo's petition and the work of the Public Petitions Committee has been so important. As Dave Stewart outlined, the committee report proposes a national strategy and action plan. My Labour colleagues and I would wholeheartedly agree with this proposal, and we would expect this to be progressed as a matter of urgency. As the Minister quite rightly says, it's not a necessity to have a time-consuming review, and where there is agreement on recommendations, we would obviously like to see those progressed as soon as possible. As many members have said, to tackle child sexual exploitation effectively, we have to look at the extent of the problem, and that means compiling and tracking statistics. I was concerned when the petition first arrived at the committee by the issues raised by children's charities such as Bernardo's about the lack of information on the number of cases of exploitation held by authorities. I understand there is currently no estimate of the prevalence of child sexual exploitation in Scotland, and although studies have taken place, they have been on a small scale. We should, of course, look at statistics with caution, and we, of course, are talking about children, not statistics. But I believe we cannot address the problem properly, or it's not properly understood, unless we have means of doing so. We need, I welcome the work that has been done to date in the Research Commission by the Scottish Government, but I believe we need more comprehensive research and we need more comprehensive data collection if we are to fully understand the extent to which it is prevalent in Scotland and what needs to be done to tackle it. The Bernardo's briefing, which members will have received in advance of this debate, supports a number of the report's recommendations and highlights the importance of engaging with children through education and work in schools. I know the committee report makes a series of recommendations around this, and I would echo calls from across the chamber for those recommendations to be progressed and for greater engagement with children and young people. We are right to acknowledge the importance of effective education programmes in helping young people to recognise and report incidents of sexual abuse. Children need to know the signs of a sexual exploitation, how to raise the alarm and where they can ask for help and get the support they need. And campaigns like the NSPCC Talking Pants campaign is an example of this. As Graham Pearson has said, of course we must look at how we prevent cases from arising, but we must also better support survivors, children and adults who have suffered exploitation as a child. I know the Petitions Committee is also currently considering Petition 1351, Time for All to be Heard, which relates to victims of institutional abuse. There are a number of adults across the country who continue to suffer the effects of being abused and exploited as a child, and I know from speaking to constituents more needs to be done to support many survivors, and I hope the Scottish Government will work with the Petitions Committee and the cross-party group on that petition. In terms of supporting survivors, as David Torrance, I think, said, we would all agree that there needs to be safe places for children experiencing sexual exploitation and other forms of abuse to go when it's not appropriate for them to return to their family home. Yet, like many other members, I was deeply concerned to learn the only dedicated young persons refuge run by Aberlour was forced to close at the end of June last year because of a funding shortfall. The provision of refuges should be a priority for the Scottish Government. I welcome what the Minister said about the Ministerial Working Group and the Minister's commitment to look again at how we support the victims of child exploitation and abuse. And I would ask the Minister to, if she would update the Parliament and other parties on this and on how the Government will support vitally important support services like the Aberlour facility. Presiding Officer, I would also like to take this opportunity to praise some of the organisations that work tirelessly to protect children from abuse and exploitation. I've mentioned that Bernardo's and Aberlour. A number of key organisations have been mentioned by members already this afternoon, but I would also like to thank the Internet Watch Foundation, which does an invaluable amount of work in preventing sexual abuse images of children from being published on the internet, which I know a number of members have raised as well. The Internet Watch Foundation work with the police and internet providers to track down individuals and rings who abuse and exploit children, as well as those that share the images. On this point, Safer Internet Day this year takes place on the 11th of February and is organised in the UK by the Safer Internet Centre. It promotes the safe and responsible use of online technology and mobile phones for children and young people. I would therefore like to encourage members and the Scottish Government to do what they can to help raise awareness of Safer Internet Day and the work of the Internet Watch Foundation. Presiding Officer, as I said at the start, this is clearly a serious issue, which I know many members have made a number of points about. Effectively, tackling child sexual exploitation requires a coordinated, multi-agency response. It is essential that all services and individual practitioners take responsibility, and I welcome the committee's plan for a national strategy and action plan and many of the recommendations. I would like to thank again all the organisations who are working flat out to reduce and prevent child sexual exploitation. Across the Chamber, we should send out the message that we continue to support them fully in the work that they do. Our children deserve no less.
Thank you very much. Now call on George Adam to be followed by Anne McTaggart. A generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd also like to thank the committee for the difficult work that they've undertaken in this inquiry. As Dave Stewart, the convener, and Angus MacDonald already said, if one child is actually helped because of this inquiry, then we've surely done something. But it is a very difficult subject, and that's been echoed by just about everyone else who's spoke on during the debate. I'd echo John Wilson saying how challenging it must have been for them, because you only need to look at the case studies in Annex A of the report and the young people involved, and bear in mind that it's not just it's not just print on the paper. You can actually see these are real young people, real lives and real issues that are happening in the world, and it's harrowing, horrific and very difficult reading for us all. But as the convener, Dave Stewart, quite rightly said, and I may be paraphrasing him, we need to know these things and we need to investigate that, because this cannot be allowed to continue. You know, Jamie Hepburn said, as a father, it's difficult to take in, to comprehend, you know, this kind of situation. I agree with him as well, because child sexual exploitation is just something that we just all repulses us when we actually hear about it, and that's why it makes the work undertaken by the committee so difficult. But I have to say that Jamie Hepburn also brought up is the fact that it involves our responsibility as parents to ensure that we know what our role is with our own children, to ensure that we can help. It's not just a case of talking to, although education has an important part of it, we all have a responsibility in this. But the Minister already said how we all felt a mixture of horror, anger and sadness at the news from Rotherham, Rochdale and the ongoing Jimmy Savile stories. You know, every one of us, it becomes extremely difficult for us to actually comprehend that some, especially the high-profile Jimmy Savile case, where someone like that could be as vile an individual as that. But I welcome the Scottish Government's setting up the Ministerial Working Group on Child Sexual Exploitation and working with the experts and those who closely work with victims of this in local authorities, the Crown Office, police and key children's organisations, because this is the best way to share best practice. As Angus MacDonald already said, there is quite a bit of good practice out there, and ensure that they can work together. Data collection was mentioned by David Torrance, and I would just say that that's probably quite an important part of the Children and Young People's Bill that's going through at the moment. Some of the evidence we've received has been the difficulty in being able to get information backwards and forwards, and one of the key issues of the Children and Young People's Bill is that we get that opportunity to share that with the named person. But one of the other things that David Torrance also mentioned was that the Vulnerable Young People and Operational Group in Renfrewshire, now this is obviously was representatives from the police, social work, education, health and children's reporter, and gives by a case-by-case basis, meets regularly and gives people the opportunity to get the information with regards to CSE as well. So I think this is an example of best practice, and it's mentioned in page 13 of the report itself. The working group is correct when they've said that this is not a standalone issue. It's something that we need to ensure that we all kind of know what's going on, and we do all we can to work together. I need to ensure we have the strongest approach in child protection. But one of the things I don't need to mention has been mentioned here on numerous occasions is, you know, the key pillar of the Children and Young People's Bill is getting it right for every child. And that's one of the main reasons that we're currently going through the parliamentary process with that bill. And I believe that the named person access till young people are 18 can actually make a difference and help with some of these cases and possibly highlight things. You know, you can't legislate for bad people, I've said this before, but what you can do is you can try and make sure that everyone gets all the information they possibly can when cases like this happen. You know, to give help and support for the young people and potentially identifying the problem as an issue. Obviously, the child plan and access to the plan will make a difference and help as well. But schools play a vital role in identifying and preventing child exploitation, ensuring that children and young people education topics such as the Minister stated about appropriate relationships, protection from abuse and keeping themselves safe from harm early on in education right till we're leaving school. You know, one of the other things that we have to say is there already are some things that the government do invest in. Respect Me and Childline are government funded and are working hard with others to help people to tackle bullying and behaviour in all forms and give advice to schools on how to encourage safe, responsible use of personal mobile technology in school and beyond. And this is one of the main issues that came up in the report, as well as we do have an issue with cyberbullying and bullying in general with young people at the moment as well. But I do welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to ensure that fast, effective protection is in place for the children at risk of abuse and neglect. They've already set up the Ministerial Working Group, which I've already mentioned, on child sexual exploitation, and there is a report back. I wait to hear what the Government actually says on the actual report itself and what they are going to do further on this one as well. One of the other things I'd like to bring up as well was some of the messages that have been highlighted. You know, the child protection is everyone's responsibility, and that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier on myself, Presiding Officer. We all have to take responsibility and ensure that we do talk about it in an open manner. I know many of us would have probably had difficulty when we saw this debate actually here to be discussed, but it's one of these things that if we don't talk about it, then who talks about it? How can we actually make sure that some of these horror stories don't happen? So just in closing, Presiding Officer, I would just like to say, you know, we have to remember that these case studies here are not just part of the report that's just to be filed away and forgotten about. This is real young people and their lives, and we have to ensure that what we do in here makes a difference in their lives.
Many thanks. Excellent. Now call on Anne McTaggart to be followed by Claire Adamson. Generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am especially pleased to participate in this debate, being a member of the Public Petitions Committee that was instrumental in producing the report on tackling child sexual exploitation. As fellow members of the committee are very much aware, the production of this report has taken now over 10 months of evidence, and the origins of which can be traced back to July 2011, when the committee received a public petition from Bernardo Scotland calling for new research into both the nature and scope of child sexual exploitation in Scotland and new Scottish Government guidelines to combat this very real problem. On hearing initial and preliminary evidence, together with evidence from the Minister of Children and Young People, Aileen Campbell, other fellow members of the committee all felt it was important and essential that an inquiry into the issues surrounding child sexual exploitation had to be undertaken. Presiding Officer, committee members at the onset of the inquiry became very aware that a number of other agencies had initiated working groups to investigate CSE. It was important thereafter not to duplicate or overlap, but to complement and enhance each investigation by setting clear terms, as we did, and 28 recommendations later. Having set the scene, Presiding Officer, I would now wish to turn my attention to the actual findings of the Petition Committee in respect to tackling CSE in Scotland. In particular, I would like to focus on 3 of the findings of the report, namely, nature and extent of CSE in Scotland, vulnerabilities of young people, socialisation of young people and early intervention. First of all, I would like to draw members' attention to the nature and extent of CSE in Scotland. The committee found that the current definition of CSE in Scotland, although it was deemed to be helpful by individuals and agencies alike, and particularly important in raising awareness and understanding of the issue, there was however, some reservations. Here the committee made a number of recommendations which included the Scottish Government to give high priority to ensuring that high-quality data collection tools which will supply vital information on the prevalence and nature of CSE in Scotland could be identified, standardised and rolled out across Scotland. Such an approach will provide vital information necessary to inform a coordinated strategy for tackling, preventing and supporting victims. And it would not need to be starting from scratch. Within the committee evidence taken, we heard from Sheila Taylor MBE and Cheryl Stevens of the National Working Group for Sexually Exploited Children and Young People. And we also heard from the Forth Valley Child Protection Committee pilot study, who both have existing data collection tools. Secondly, it would be true to say that all children and young people are vulnerable to some extent, no matter how well they are nurtured and supported by their family and their schools. But within the Scottish society, there are particular groups of children and young people that are especially vulnerable. That is those children and young people in the care system. As a consequence, it is of particular importance that the committee's recommendations with regard to the children and young people in the care system are taken forward as a high priority. Thirdly, as a mother of 3 children, 2 of whom are teenagers, with the third in primary school, I cannot emphasise enough the vital role that education programmes can play in not only making young people aware of the dangers and pitfalls, especially within the era of instant global communications, and as other members have mentioned and highlighted, the use and misuse of social networking is a hugely worrying concern and should be tackled. Hence, the need for the Scottish Government to take on board in addressing the committee's recommendations as to the socialisation of young people and early intervention. Presiding Officer, prior to concluding, I would wish to draw the Chamber's attention to the vital role which education in its broadest sense, and here I would also include training as to play in tackling, preventing and supporting victims of child sexual exploitation. In concluding, Presiding Officer, I cannot overestimate to members the importance of the Public Petitions Committee overarching recommendation to the Scottish Government for the development of a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation. Such a national strategy would provide a framework for a coordinated national approach which would have tripartite goal of tackling CSE, preventing CSE and supporting victims of CSE. Only by having such an approach would the issues which I highlighted earlier be addressed in striving to provide a society which has at its core the safety and well-being of its children and young people from the scourge of child sexual exploitation.
Thanks very much. Now call on Claire Adamson, after which we move to closing speeches. 7 minutes, please, or thereby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin this afternoon by thanking my colleagues who sit on the Public Petitions Committee for their dedication in bringing this important issue to the Chamber this afternoon. I echo Liam MacArthur's comments in my own experience in Education and Culture Committee inquiries that informs that this would have been a very hard, uncomfortable and at times harrowing experience for the members of the committee, and I for one are grateful for their efforts during the inquiry and for their contributions this afternoon. Of course, this is as nothing to the experience of the frontline workers, such as Bernardo's, the third sector organisations who work in this area, and also the people who contributed to the report in their personal experiences, and I thank them for their bravery and candour in doing so. I believe that everyone in this chamber holds the well-being and safety of our young people foremost in their minds in debating the committee report this afternoon. Just yesterday, online in the Newcastle Chronicles live online edition, there was an article about this very issue, and it's entitled West End Community Shock at Child Sex Exploitation Allegations. And it says, people living in Newcastle's West End yesterday told of their horror at learning that a number of their neighbours had been arrested by police probing a conspiracy to rape young women and teenage girls. This was done under Operation Sanctuary. And the article says, today some of the Stocks residents of the West End have told of their disgust at what had been going on behind closed doors in their community. The article has many contributions from local people, but I would like to highlight in particular Dr Hari Shukla, a former director of Tyne and Wear Racial Equality Council, who spoke of his upset at the size of this supposedly targeted criminal activity at young women. Dr Shukla is a member of the Newcastle Safeguarding Initiative, founded 10 years ago to make sure schools, young people and families in the city were working together to protect children in the community. And he said, we are upset by it. An alleged crime like this is not acceptable. It's just wrong, and I'm certain that all of the communities involved feel the same way. Presiding Officer, the shock and horror of this community and their reaction is both recognisable and understandable, but it does to bring home to all of us that this type of child sex exploitation can be happening, and that it is incumbent on all of us, all of Scotland's communities, to be aware and vigilant in this area. I welcome the comments from the Minister for Children and Young People when she launched the expert group on tackling child sex exploitation. Sexual exploitation of children is a reality here in Scotland. Anyone thinks our nation is immune from its appalling crime is simply wrong. It is a problem we face and a problem we must face up to. Research we published last year is clear that there is no reason to believe that Scotland is any different from any other countries in this. Our aim, therefore, must be to ensure that child sexual exploitation in Scotland can be detected, dealt with and ultimately prevented. I welcome the committee report, and as a member of the Education and Culture Committee, I am aware that much of the work undertaken sits alongside our deliberations on the Children and Young People's Bill, which will come before this chamber in its Stage 3 deliberations shortly. One area that was proved to be controversial in that area, and in my mind received a disproportionate amount of attention, was the bill's proposal for a named person. And I note that the Petitions Committee recommends included a request for a named person to support victims of CSE through the justice process. But the other evidence that we've also heard in the Chamber today about the vulnerability of any young person online, in social medias, in a chat room, and the risks there in other social settings has confirmed my conclusion that the named person role, a person who is an appropriate professional for a young person, whatever their circumstance, whether that be in the justice system, children's hearings, or in the kind of social work or receiving additional support needs, stands as one that's very important. As Dave Stewart said, if one child could be saved from the work this committee had done, it would have been worth it. And I feel the same way about named person being in statute on that bill, that just one person, one headline that we don't have to read of a tragedy will have been worth the effort in putting that in place. I hope those opposed to a named person will reflect on this report and indeed the debate this afternoon, as this measure is supported by children's charities, including Bernardo's, who have brought this petition to the Petitions Committee, and also Aberlour have provided briefings this afternoon. Our health... Yes, I will do.
Liam MacArthur. I'm very grateful to Claire Adamson for taking an intervention. She'll know that I certainly support the principle of named person, but actually one of the concerns that those of us who have still been willing to support the principle have had is the diversion of resources away from areas of specific welfare need as opposed to a wider well-being definition. Does she not feel that those concerns are still there, and we do need to be vigilant that the attention is focused on those areas where concerns around welfare are particularly pronounced?
I absolutely understand the concern that has been raised in this issue, but I do think that the evidence we have taken in committee has shown that the use of a named person will be measured and appropriate to the particular child. Most children will have no need of a named person, but the fact that it's normalised and a universal service makes it an opportunity for any child who could be in need from any background to have someone to contact should they feel the need. And I think that's a very important part of why that should be included in the bill and why it reflects the work that this committee has done in that area. I also sit on the European and External Relations Committee, And last year we took evidence from Maria Visalado, the European Commissioner for Trafficking, and I think the work that's been done in trafficking in Europe is very important. She described the EU as looking at trafficking as being a fundamentally human rights violation, as a serious form of organised crime. We want to clarify how we understand trafficking of human beings. Of course, there's a legal framework and a legal definition. However, to put it simply, it's about people who live under appalling conditions and work for or provide services to others against their will, with absolutely no choice to escape, whose lives are often in danger, whose families can be threatened, and who often disappear. And she also went on to say that of the hundreds of thousands of people in Europe today who are trafficked, the data that we do have suggests that 62% of those who have been identified are women and girls who have been trafficked for sexual exploitation. So Scotland does not stand alone in tackling this issue, and I think we could look to the directive coming in human trafficking to see how we might be tackling these issues, and also looking at how the UK might tackle demand in this issue as well.
Many thanks. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Liz Smith. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In her capacity as Chair of the Ministerial Working Group on Child Sexual Exploitation, Jackie Brock of Children in Scotland described the issue as particularly complex. She's right, and for exactly the same reasons that were set out by the convener of the Petitions Committee in his opening remarks at the start of this debate. I think members this afternoon have said that not only are there few subjects as quite so distressing as this, but few are quite so hard to tackle given the difficulties in uncovering the true extent of the problem. Several members have quite rightly highlighted that we know, thanks to the researchers from the University of Bedfordshire, that the extent of child sexual exploitation is extremely difficult to establish. The problem, they state, is not visible, and it has much to do with the entirely understandable reluctance of the victims to come forward, as it has to do with the hidden nature of the crimes and those who perpetrate them. We know too, as with evidence, that the very high-profile cases that we've had in places like Rochdale and Oxford, just how sensitive this subject is within the public mood, a point that I think was extremely well put by Jamie Hepburn and John Wilson, and also a point that was made by Graham Pearson in, I thought, a very thoughtful contribution, given his experiences in the police service, which obviously brought a greater degree of understanding to some of this issue than perhaps the rest of us do. All this matters, Deputy Presiding Officer, because the problem can only be fully addressed if we understand its nature, its prevalence and its extent. And we have a definition of child sexual exploitation in Scotland, but as Anne McTaggart rightly said, there have been some issues about that, and I think the line between such crimes and other forms of abuse can be extremely thin. In truth, there is often a cyclical relationship between the two, and I think that can add even more complexity. As Jane Baxter rightly said in her contribution, the study that was conducted by Celsus into the sexual exploitation of looked-after children was particularly important in terms of providing evidence, and not least because obviously it throws up the fact that those who are in that circumstance are particularly vulnerable, not least because obviously they're often in that care system for the very reason that they have been abused or exploited. Martin Henry of Stop It Now warned that it would be very dangerous to separate child exploitation from the actual wider child sexual abuse agenda. And I think we've got to take that comment very seriously, but it does at the same time add that greater degree of complexity. So given this, it's easier to appreciate where the Ministerial Working Group was coming from. It is a very real problem, but it's quite often unseen. It's a distinct problem, but closely related to other crimes. And as Jackson Carlo very rightly said in another very thought-provoking speech, it actually throws up a lot of the dilemmas that we face as parliamentarians. Notwithstanding that, I think the steps that have been taken are very much in the right direction, and obviously the Public Petitions Committee's report is hugely helpful in this regard, as are the deliberations of so many in the voluntary sector, including the ever-helpful Barnardo's. The Scottish Government and the Ministerial Working Group have shown a real determination to address the issue head-on, and to improve Scotland's national child protection guidance. And that's something we've seen both in terms of the drugs debate and the alcohol debate, that we have to be bold, we have to be persuaded, perhaps in some cases, to go into areas that perhaps it would not always be the choosing of parliamentarians. Now, I was not somebody who sat through the committee's deliberation at first hand, but the committee report for me sends out some key messages, and if I may, Deputy Presiding Officer, if I could just deal with a few of these. Firstly, in this age of very rapid online communication, more and more youngsters, even those from very secure backgrounds, are in danger of falling victim to sexual exploitation. But there are clearly some groups where they are particularly vulnerable, and I thought Gil Patterson made a good point in terms of the responsibility of where that lies, and I would suggest that it is an area that needs very urgent attention, but I don't pretend for a moment that I have any answers in this respect. But I think it is something that is very much coming up the political agenda just now. A second point, which was raised several times in the report, is the need to identify and help victims as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And we have seen lots of initiatives, I believe, where that has been made more possible, but I do take on board the points from several members in the Chamber this afternoon about trying to draw together that into some coherent strategy. And I fully accept what the Minister is saying about we don't want just another war of words, we don't want another review. It has to be about action. But I think in instances we have got some good experience to base our future policy on, whether that's in Operation Dash, which I think was in February 2013, investigated CSE in the 12 local authorities of the then Strathclyde police area, which worked very closely with Bernardo's own policy areas. And I think it was very helpful to identify the 4 categories that help inform us about the responses there. I think we've seen situations in Derby and Keighley in the south where we've had some interesting responses too, and that again has helped to inform policy. And may I share the concerns that were raised by Neil Bibby and David Stewart about the Aberlour situation in Glasgow. I think, I'm absolutely certain that Aberlour are very keen to work with the Scottish Government to address this situation, because obviously the opportunity to have safe places means so much to those children who need to have some help and need to have a situation where they can feel that they are totally secure. So I hope that offer, Minister, will be taken up from Aberlour. And just to finish off, Presiding Officer, I think a third very important issue which was set out by my colleague Jackson Carlow is about the training issue and the education issue, but not forgetting parenting and the responsibilities that we all have in making sure that the information on which we drive policy forward is both accurate and it can be used in a coherent manner. So, Presiding Officer, just to finish, I think this has been a very interesting debate, a very helpful debate, and could I thank the Petitions Committee for their work.
I now call on Jim Maxer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've listened with great interest to the debate this afternoon. And whilst it's fair to say that the topic is not the easiest to hear about, think about or deal with, indeed, as George Adams said, it often brings feelings of revulsion, but it's really important that we as elected representatives take this topic on and take steps to move it forward, because it's too important. It's too important for the victims of child sexual exploitation, and it's too important for the agencies in the public and voluntary sector who work so hard to reach out and support those young people. So we have a responsibility as members of the Scottish Parliament to bring to bear all our influence and resources to make improvements in this area of work. Once again, as so often in debates in this chamber on issues affecting children and young people, we've heard about the need to listen to young people themselves, and that's come through very strongly. And the committee has taken that feedback from young people, and it's taken all the evidence that it gathered, and it's used that to build up a strong set of recommendations. It's used an in-depth approach, working with service providers and service users and other agencies, and the input of all those people has made a profound influence on the work of the committee and the debate today. I'd like to turn to part 4 of the committee's report, which focuses on support, education and training. And it's clear that this can only come about when the young people themselves have trust in agencies and organisations who set out to help and support them. The confidentiality of such processes is key, and the role of third sector agencies is vital in delivering essential support services for young people. David Torrance made a very thoughtful contribution on that issue. He spoke about the role of the third sector in engaging with young people. Very often the third sector is where young people are at, if I can use the modern terminology. They're engaging directly with young people, perhaps in lots of other circumstances, and can use that relationship to talk about child sexual exploitation. Again, through that relationship that they have, they can introduce preventative education, awareness raising for young people, but also for their families, their parents. They're uniquely placed to do that. And they can also offer emotional support to young people and their families. So the role of the third sector is extremely powerful in taking forward these issues. The convener of the committee highlighted 2 case studies which clearly showed the importance of supporting vulnerable young people and of public awareness raising. Neil Bibby and Graham Pearson both spoke about their work in supporting vulnerable constituents and the need for training of staff who work with young people. And I think the third sector is very well placed to share its experience and to perhaps work with the public sector to build skills, to build a skills base. The report and many of the colleagues in the Chamber today picked up on the closure in 2013 of the only refuge service for young people. Aberlour, who ran the service, have highlighted that one of the problems with the service's sustainability was the poor rate of referrals to the service. And that again brings us to the fact that young people, you're not going to get people to come to a refuge by saying, open for business, here's the runaway refuge service. Young people aren't going to respond to that. You need to be much more sensitive and diplomatic and clever in engaging with young people. But Aberlour have highlighted that every 5 minutes a young person in the UK runs away from home, often from neglect or harm. So it's worrying that a low referral rate seems to have contributed to the refuge's closure. Clearly, there are a number of factors to be considered with regard to Aberlour's decision. So I was pleased to hear the Minister agree the need to better understand what services can be provided to help vulnerable young people and how we can take that forward. Many members, including David Torrance and John Wilson, have highlighted the geographical variation in both service provision and data collection across the country. As part of its support for the committee's recommendation of an overarching national strategy, Scottish Labour would be keen to see further research and improved data collection strategy for Scotland. As Neil Bibby said, we are dealing with children, not statistics, but we must gather that data to fully understand the scale of the challenge, particularly into areas highlighted in the report, such as the prevalence of child sexual exploitation in rural and remote areas. Another area where I'd be keen to see more work is in the pursuit of child sexual exploitation as an offence. Whilst the Short-Life Ministerial Working Group notes it is generally satisfied that there were no significant gaps in the overall scope of the criminal law to pursue child sexual exploitation as an offence, Liam MacArthur spoke of the need for a better understanding of child sexual exploitation, and many members today have commented on the increasing need to do that in the world we live in, where internet and social media play such an important role in the lives of many young people. And we don't fully understand that, and see that in my own family with young people that I know. They're quite immersed in the world of the internet, and I think if we're going to try and understand the issue and define what child sexual exploitation is, we've got to look at the role the internet plays in that, and perhaps when we're looking at defining it as an offence, we could take that on board. The evidence was given to the committee that criticised the use of existing powers. The report notes, and again members today have picked up on this, that the committee remains dissatisfied by the responses of Police Scotland, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service and the Lord Advocate to the concerns raised about the 2009 Sexual Offences Act and the 2005 Protection of Children and Prevention of Sexual Offences Act. In this instance, it's clear that post-legislative scrutiny of the 2005 Act is required. Angus MacDonald spoke about the need for training and support for police officers, and also the need to react strongly to prosecute perpetrators. and legislation needs to pick up on that.
If you could bring your remarks to a close.
Okay. John Wilson also spoke about the role of the Care Inspectorate. Members will be aware of the proposed human trafficking bill being brought forward by my colleague Jenny Mara. I understand the Government is looking for ways that this can be taken forward, and I was pleased to hear Claire Adamson pick up on that topic as well. And in closing, the committee was clear in its report that it didn't want to rip up the rule book and start again, but instead to build on the existing work undertaken in Scotland to tackle the problem of child sexual exploitation and to fill in the gaps of policy and practice. Scottish Labour reiterates its support for the recommendations of the committee report and, in particular, the creation and implementation of a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation.
Thank you very much. I now call on Aileen Campbell. Minister, you've got till 4:50.
4:50. Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think that we've heard some very powerful speeches in what has been a very constructive debate, and I thank the members for their very positive contributions. A number of valuable points have been raised, an agreement that this is an issue for Scotland to tackle, as Claire Adamson and many others have stated, and that there should be absolutely no complacency for us in Scotland about the issue of child sexual exploitation. And it has been recognised in our 2010 revised child protection guidance to cover key areas of child sexual exploitation, including online grooming and child trafficking. And we had already decided to further refresh our national guidance. But I again thank the committee for their continued work on this issue and for the contribution to this area. Now, a number of points have been raised, and I want to go through some of them, and I hope I do cover most of the points that have been mentioned throughout this debate. Dave Stewart and others spoke about the need to have a better definition of child sexual exploitation in Scotland to aid with the better understanding of what it is. I think a point also made by Liam MacArthur. And we have worked with Bernardo's to update the definition of child sexual exploitation, and this will feature in the new section on child sexual exploitation to be published in the newly refreshed National Child Protection Guidance in the coming months. So I hope that that gives some comfort to those who have sought that better definition and a much more widely understood definition of what this issue is. One of the other themes that was discussed was around the need for a new national strategy. And again, I would reiterate the points made in my opening remarks that we need action. And I'm glad that Jackson Carlaw shares my concern that a further review could risk delaying action to tackle this pernicious and vile crime, and a crime that is also very highly complex. Bernardo's briefing states that a national action plan would set out the actions we need to take and will bring together the good work being done. And many have spoken about this good work and good practice in their remarks this afternoon. And it can also include the recommendations of both the Ministerial Working Group and the committee's report. Aberlour's briefing also highlighted that a national strategy might also necessitate a prolonged period of further consultation and delay measures that need to be taken, a point also made by Jamie Hepburn. But nevertheless, the good recommendations that came from the report will certainly be considered thoroughly by myself and the rest of government. Now, many members also raised the issue of Aberlour's decision to close their young runaway refuge. And we need to bottom out why and better understand why services have struggled to remain sustainable. I think that was a point that Jane Baxter was making sure that we do properly understand why this hasn't been as widely used as we maybe would have liked or hoped. And I will ask the expert group that has just reviewed child sexual exploitation on the Parliament's behalf to review the committee's recommendations here. And I will also ensure that the review includes a better understanding of what services are needed and to work with local areas on their own provision. Jackson Carlaw also raised the issue of risk of sexual harm orders, and I said in my opening remarks that the Scottish Government had strengthened the laws around sex crimes, and I'm confident that Police Scotland shares our commitment to protecting our most vulnerable citizens, and it will carefully consider the committee's recommendations around risk of sexual harm orders, including any improvements that can be made. And we're also considering whether there is scope more generally to extend the protection offered by these orders. And I believe, like others have mentioned, Graham Pearson's comments were an expertise on this issue was also very useful for this debate. And I agree that Mr Gwynn's role in CEOP offers us opportunities here in Scotland. Now, I want to turn now to education, because that was a substantial theme in itself, and I want to start off by talking about online concerns. I think an issue raised by Graham Pearson, Angus MacDonald and Jamie Hepburn all mentioned that in their remarks. Now, the recent summit that I've already mentioned in the intervention to, I think, Graham Pearson on internet safety identified that better information sharing between professionals, parents and young people is key to improving online safety. And the Scottish Stakeholder Group on Child Internet Safety will take forward the recommendations from the summit this year. Respect Me and Childline are government funded and are working hard with others to help people to tackle bullying behaviour in all forms and deal with its consequences, while our schools will be talking to children and young people about broader online risks. Furthermore, in relation to some of the issues raised around looked after children, Respect Me is also working with local authorities and residential care establishments to build capacity and confidence to deal with all bullying, and that's aligned to our much broader national approach. Advice has also been given to schools on how to encourage safe and responsible use of personal mobile technology in school and beyond. And this is also designed to protect staff, children and young people from harassment and abuse, including the dangers of uploading indecent images, which can arise from the misuse of such technology. But an important balance also needs to be struck so we don't over-dramatise the safe use of the use of internet, and further push young people into being more secretive about internet use, and to ensure that we get the action absolutely right. Young people's voices must be heard, and that was a key point that came through from the internet safety, that we don't over-dramatise it and risk more young people further getting pushed into unsafe practices. Yep.
MacArthur.
I thank the Minister for taking the intervention, and thank her also for the comments she's made, which was a concern I was trying to develop in my own comments. Does she think actually there's probably a risk that in providing overly kind of generalised comments in relation to the risks and safe usage, that we risk turning off young people to the actual risks, and therefore there's a challenge to be as specific as we can in terms of the advice that we're providing and the nature of the risks that are undoubtedly out there?
That was another point, I think, related to the fact that we need to hear young people's voices about what types of things they would like to engage with, and that was why there were young people there at the summit that we hosted, and they made a number of very good points. And I think, we're always going to be playing catch-up with how the internet develops, so we always have to be on the front foot with this issue, and I think the points that Liam make are very valid. Now, aside, though, from online safety and education's role in this, Curriculum for Excellence provides opportunities for education about appropriate relationships and health and well-being. And Education Scotland support this work through showcasing good practice via stakeholder networks and GLOW, the intranet. But to develop the points made by George Adam, Jackson Carlaw, Anne McTaggart and Jamie Hepburn about parenting, which I think is an important one, because it's right to broaden out the interest of child sexual exploitation beyond government, because society has a role too, and families and parents have an important part to play. These issues for parents aren't easy to talk about, so we do need to support parents, and the guidance around relationships, sexual health and parenthood education has been revised, and we're currently reviewing the responses to a recent consultation with a view to issue revised guidance this spring.
If you could bring your remarks to a close soon.
Okay, so further I was also to just point to the National Parenting Strategy, which is for all parents, and often the danger is that we assume that parenting strategy is only for parents of young people, and we've already held a number of meetings and conferences around parenting of teenagers. The points around data collection, which I'll briefly just say are important and valid ones. We've got the University of Bedfordshire work, and we've also got the Forth Valley pilot, which once we know the outcomes from that, we'll be able to consider whether there is an appropriate use for across the whole of Scotland. Now, the Children and Young People Bill also gives us further opportunities to talk about this issue, but we need to make sure that children are safe. This is a good debate and there's more work to be done, and I thank again the committee's work in ensuring that we cannot lose sight of the vile nature of child sexual exploitation and keeping children and young people safe.
Thank you. I now call on Chick Brodie to wind up the debate. Mr Brodie, if you could continue until 5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all come to this place, I believe, amid sometimes rhetoric and cosmetics to try to make a difference, however big or however small, to our fellow citizens. I believe today in this debate we have collectively demonstrated the need for expressing that difference in the name of our children. Nelson Mandela in 1997 said there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. I think today's debate has indeed exemplified that, and in the face of what John Wilson said was a very challenging inquiry. What it means for us in the society we wish to reflect in Scotland. I wish to acknowledge, as has been done, all of those that have participated, as the convener did, and particularly Bernardo's for bringing this petition to us. The report is very comprehensive, and while I will address this, before I do that, may I congratulate all of the participants in the debate today. It's salutary to look at some of the words that have been used, like neglect, revulsion, disjointed, trust, lack of coordination, gaps in communication, and so on. I think particularly the contribution of Jane Baxter and Jackson Carlaw are to be commended. So the report is comprehensive, Presiding Officer, and that we are talking in this inquiry particularly not just about cause and effect, but above all the need for action. The report in many ways considers the effect and the recommendations to mitigate the effects, and I will come to these in a minute. But the cause is as important. If I may, I'd like to consider the cause first, so I start perversely with part 5 of the report, i.e. how do we disrupt and prosecute and severely penalise the perpetrators. And what I have to say has to have some bearing, as I'm sure it will, on the proposed Children and Young Persons Bill. Bernardo's Daljeet Dagan explained, as Angus MacDonald said, that she had talked about the triangle approach that Bernardo's developed, where the focus is on the victim, but where there is also recognition that there is a child sex offender and a facilitator. We have to flip the triangle over, she said, and focus on disrupting and prosecuting the perpetrators, and we should identify locations where they will operate and focus and police them better. And that is not just for the police organisation. It's for the third sector agencies and families, as has been mentioned today. Just as Police Scotland said the wider community was pivotal to recognise and reporting CSE, it was equally asked why the Protection of Children Prevention of Sexual Offences Act of 2005 had not been used effectively, if at all. It is not acceptable that if the Act was to give new tools and powers to the police, that if the FOI requests in 2012 found that between them, Lothian Borders and Strathclyde Police Forces had only issued 2 RHSOs. The same applied to the sexual offence prevention orders, where only 1.05% of offenders on the sexual offenders register had these SOPOS orders applied. But I welcome Police Scotland's commitment to secure additional mandatory training, highlighting all the legislative options open to them, and its optimism, and I'm sure not misplaced, the single service that will ensure Scotland has a wider approach for ensuring victims are protected. But of course, Presiding Officer, is not just down to the police, but as I said, to a multi-agency approach. Now that said, we have had several, if not many, organisations, be it the Ministerial Short Life Working Group, National Working Group for Sexually Exploited Children, Children's Commissioner, inquiry into CSE and gangs and groups, the COP assessment, NSPCC and others, assessing and reporting on the effects and leading up to child sexual exploitation. And of course we have, as I said, running in parallel with this inquiry and report, the proposed Children and Young Persons Bill. It would be wrong to suggest, Presiding Officer, that nothing is happening, because it is. 2 examples are Bernards in Scotland have established in Renfrewshire, working with the local police to better protect children subject to who go missing, and with a particular focus on CSEs. Or Glasgow Child Protection Committee, which has a multi-agency approach to investigation of CSE. But it is too disparate, too inconsistent, and frankly not joined up as we might wish, as John Wilson pointed out. I say there are, and despite many examples of good practice across Scotland, the response is patchy, and the various demands to address the support needs of children in a coordinated way was questioned by the committee. Addressing children's needs and vulnerabilities, the training of those involved in detecting targeted CSE children, the supporting through and after CSE experiences, and the disrupting and catching of actual and would-be perpetrators, all of these the committee believed were inadequately coordinated. That is why, Presiding Officer, the inquiry suggests that there should be, in fact, as has been mentioned, a national strategy for tackling child sexual exploitation. That should include the organisation to coordinate a national approach to tackling and preventing this enemy within, that is CSE, and one that will support the victims. The committee noted that the proposed Children and Young People's Bill was imminent and suggested that the serious issue of CSE should be considered as part of that bill's scrutiny, or at least in tandem with it. Presiding Officer, a feature of that bill is the requirement for a named person to consider a child's interest. Within the committee's proposal of a national framework, we suggest the government establish, and as soon as possible, that a named person or indeed overarching organisation may be made directly responsible for an accelerated coordination and implementation of the processes and communication links to not reduce, but to eradicate this scourge from our communities. Any strategy, any organisation in total to be successful must understand the problem, what it is, and how it is defined. And of course it's contiguous with sexual abuse, but has a particular black form with the attendant material seductions. The basis of any successful tactical operation that flows from the strategy must be a composite of key elements that the committee considered from not just the organisation, but the critical factors that are aligned in the recommendations. Presiding Officer, I wish I could say that I had been delighted at participating in this inquiry. Delight is the wrong word. Harrowing is much more appropriate. It could have done and dug so much more with so much more time. However, the committee's request for the government, particularly to develop a framework which has been accepted, a cooperative organisation with clear responsibilities, with required outcomes, and a data mechanism to scope the challenge will, on acceptance, be a huge step forward, and I welcome the proposed national plan. Presiding Officer, I started with a quote from Nelson Mandela, and if I may, I'd like to finish with another quote from him. He said, "Our children are our greatest treasures. They are our future. Those who would abuse them, they tear at the fabric of our society and they weaken our nation." Hopefully the Petitions Committee report will go some way to making sure that this does not happen. Presiding Officer, we ignore this report, I believe, at our peril. It is significant. The recommendations are highly significant, and if not attended, will eat away at our social fabric and the social relationships therein. I would ask, I would encourage, I would plead that all members read the detail of this report, read it for every recommendation, every word, and what it means to our children and our society. Thank you.
That concludes the debate on the Public Petitions Committee's report on tackling child sexual exploitation. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 8837 in the name of Michael Matheson on the Children and Families Bill UK legislation. I call on Michael Matheson to move the motion. Minister.
Moved.
Question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8859 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to the business programme for tomorrow, Wednesday 29th January. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8859.
Moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8859 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is decision time. The next item, there are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 8840 in the name of David Stewart on the report on Tackling-Child-Sexual-Exploitation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8837 in the name of Michael Matheson on Children and Families Bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.